Hi, welcome back to the TT Wine Explorer podcast. I'm Tania Tomaszewska. Today's episode is about Napa Valley, California. For many of you out there, Napa will be synonymous with Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay, and also known for its very famous wineries and estates, not to mention, in many cases, very expensive wine. And indeed, Napa Valley is considered to be one of the world's top regions for its expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon. But Napa is much more than that. It's a beautiful region to travel to and through. It has a fantastic food scene and a beautiful wine country. It's fantastic just to be there and relax, and there's so much more. As is the case with many other New World wine regions, Napa's roots go back to the 1800s when immigrant farming families came to America from Italy and other parts of the world. They started a new life and planted vines. But it really wasn't until the first half of the 20th century when commercial winemaking in Napa started to pick up steam, gathering huge momentum by the 1970s. And indeed, it was the Judgment of Paris in 1976 when world-renowned British wine merchant Stephen Spurrier, in part, really put Napa Valley on the map when he organized the Judgment of Paris. The European wine trade was shocked when two wines from Napa Valley won this competition, beating out the French wines. Some people call this tasting the one that was heard around the world. Today's episode is, in part, about going back to Napa Valley of the 1960s and 70s, and before Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay became royalty there. It's about going back to the future in terms of embracing and borrowing from the past as we move forward in a new or different approach to winemaking, and in a changing world of acute weather swings, climate change, and shifting consumer desires. But actually, it's not a new direction, for as my guest today explains and illustrates, it's old school new. My guest is Billy Davies of Billy D Wines, based in St. Helena, a beautiful town and one of my favorite parts of Napa Valley. Billy knows a lot about this region and the wine industry. He knows firsthand about the heydays of Napa, as he essentially grew up at, on, and in Schramsberg Vineyards, one of the most prestigious sparkling wine producers in America. Billy's parents took over and restored Schramsberg in 1965, so Billy got a lot of experience working at the family business. But he's also worked with other organizations such as Southern Wine and Spirits, Beringer, and other premium wine producers. Billy's also taught wine business at Cal Poly, and he's been involved in other entrepreneurial endeavors, including the topic of today's episode, Billy D Wines. I met Billy about 6 years ago now, I think. He was a fellow participant in the wine executive program at the University of California, Davis, which I attended. And for longtime listeners of this podcast series, you'll recall that I also met Beth Willard, my guest in episode 12 about the view from London and old vines, during this very same course. As was the case when I met Beth during that program, I remember liking Billy instantly. He had so much knowledge, so many observations, and all of this imparted in a very relaxed and non-pretentious manner. I love this about Northern Californians. Billy was also keen to learn and hear about what was going on up here in Canada wine-wise, and I recall many fantastic conversations amongst our group. I have such gratitude for Billy not only for coming onto my show today, but for inviting me, Beth, and others from our UC Davis program to join him for a visit and personalized tour of Schramsberg when our course wrapped. He told us about what it was like growing up in Napa Valley back in the day and took us through their hand-dug caves to have some tasting and to see where this famous sparkling wine came from. It's a day I'll never forget. I hope that you enjoy my discussion with Billy Davies today. Let's fly. Hi, Billy. Thanks so much for joining as my guest today.
Tania, well, it's great to be reunited with you, and we have fun memories, and that was a wonderful background and introduction that you led us into. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I know that we could talk for hours, and I hope that someday we can get together with some wine in hand and your wine and clink glasses and do that. But for today's episode, I thought that we could focus on what you're doing in Napa Valley with Billy D Wines and Ramble, and also about your observations and insights around the future of winemaking generally in your region, you know, in the context of drought, climate change, and shifting consumer landscape. But before we dive into all of that, I'd like to kick off with how this all started with you. You've had a really layered life adventure in the wine world. And as I've mentioned, you've lived in this iconic region of Napa. And, you know, I imagine that this journey essentially started when your parents drove up that hill to Schramsberg. So for those who don't know your story, could you share a brief high-level snapshot of your path from that point in time, starting as a young man or a boy, to where you're sitting now with your Billy D's and Ramble project?
Well, sure. And as you talk about, driving up the road, to Schramsberg, this was 1965, and my dad and I were actually the first ones, in the family to arrive. My brother Hugh, who's today the CEO of Schramsberg, was just in my mother's womb at that time, and she was, not arriving yet at the same time as my dad and me. But he had an old international pickup truck that he bought used, and we jostled up this, rutted dirt road up to the Schramsberg, hillside vineyard, and arriving at this, great Victorian mansion that was built in 1875. And I remember, I was 4 years old, but I can remember the vibe coming into this, vacant old, sort of ghost of a place. And there was no furniture but a grand piano, and there were bats circling around this old house. And we just like spent the first night there, like literally like camped out on the floor, dad and me. And it was a real adventure, ever more from there, and reclaiming the hillside, and the caves with the dirt floors, and eventually making them concrete floors, and going back to the where the vineyard sites had been that had been reclaimed by forest, and seeing old vines amidst the trees, but that had all overgrown, and sort of reclearing sections of the original vineyards. And I remember, just that as a kid, the visceral sort of the scent of the dirt and the earth as the land was being cleared, and the digging holes to plant rootstock, and just learning these things as a little kid. And but yes, I got to do many jobs over the years, helping out in the vineyard and in the caves, doing bottling and stacking champagne bottles, sparkling wine bottles, entourage in the caves, working in the harvest, season, working for some other wineries too. But Schramsberg, coming back to life with, the sort of the personalities and the characters that traipsed through the Napa Valley of the 60s. It was quite a, just an adventurous time and down to earth. And a lot of that, is what, I mean, I did things, of course, during the years, but circling back to inspire what Billy D, thinks of today, a lot of that like information and inspiration comes out of that era of like this sort of magical, down to earth time of the early 60s and 70s in Napa. But to your question about some of the things that, I did along the way, yeah, learning different jobs, doing the work, learning how to prune, in the frosty mornings, working, harvest through in the cellar, picking grapes. I mean, there's a picture on the Billy D bottle of wine that's like taken in 1970 with, me and my brother picking grapes into wooden lug boxes, and back in those days. I went to school, growing up in St. Helena. I mean, the mountain vineyard was like in between St. Helena and Calistoga, up on the hills. But I went to school through the end of high school in St. Helena, and then went off to college, liberal arts, and really circled back, pretty quickly to a sales and marketing track and career in wine. And yes, as you mentioned, I worked for some other people like Southern Wine and Spirits, and Behringer's portfolio at that time. And then my dad hired me to be a regional sales manager for Schramsberg, based on the East Coast. And I eventually became director of sales and marketing for Schramsberg. And as you also alluded, I've taught wine business, at a university level. I've been involved in some other entrepreneurial projects. I'm on the board of directors of Schramsberg today. And most important, in my current business life, is that I launched Billy D Wines, starting really with the 2020 harvest. So that kind of circles us to where we are like right now. And I would say that the inspiration for Billy D Wines like really goes right back to that sort of era of adventure and experimentation and more down to earthness of like that time frame, 60s and 70s in the Napa Valley.
Thank you so much. So back back where you started, in a way, a big circle, a big loop, but by no means going backwards. And I'll come back to your label. So thank you for mentioning the photo on your label, because when we come down to talking about the vessels and your closures and things like that, I'd love to tie that in. What I love about your synopsis of your path is it shows you're not only knowing grape to glass, everything before the grape is grown and to after the glass for the consumer journey. And I think that your insight for all levels of not only winemaking, but what we're making it for and who our consumer is, you've got such a great experience and toolkit of all those points. And I just think that your description illustrates that. So thank you so much. And congratulations on your new pursuit with Ramble and Billy D Wines.
Thank you.
So on that, you mentioned the launch in 2020, and I love the landing page for your website. It says bucket, and I feel that it sets the scene and tone for one of your missions. I mean, you mentioned hearkening back to a time more casual. Sounds to me like more back to basics, get back, less is more. And I think this is something that people now, particular post 2020, post pandemic in the world we're in, less is more, back to basics, back to the future, so to speak. So could you, getting down into your wines, could you provide a bit of an overview of each of your, these lines, Ramble, Billy D, what kind, why do you have two separate brands? What kind of wines are in each portfolio? Who are they for?
Sure. And, I'll just take off on your observation about the tagline bucket. It's sort of like having fun, bucking, just like the same old, same old. And Billy D, makes me think of the Billy Goat is like this icon for Billy D and sort of, and I feel like there's an opportunity coming out of this history and legacy and all this great past and lore and experience of California wine and Napa in particular, where I grew up, is what is it about all that and looking back that's actually really fresh and energetic and relevant for sort of the crossroads where we find ourselves today. And that's a mission, for me, how do we keep wine on the table and vibrant and appealing and provocative for younger generations of consumers who are getting on sort of the escalator to wine. And for me, part of that formula was let's look back at what was lively and cool and just down to earth and fun that was happening long ago. And so bringing that to your question about the particulars of my labels and what does it stand for. There were a few things that that I really want that this all stood for. Billy D Wines. One was looking back and looking at grape varieties that were more part of the past that had been sort of lost and overtaken by other things. And sometimes sometimes something that's really a great fit might just become overruled by fashion or other trends, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have its relevancy or that it might not be time to bring it back. So Billy D Wines looks back to varieties that used to be more prominent in this time frame where I grew up. So the labels that I make, Chenin Blanc and Napa Gamay and Barbera and French Colombard, and these are the kind of grape varieties that go into the wines. So then, to answer your question about the two different labels, I created one label called Ramble, and the name Ramble literally made me think of having a ramble sort of out in the vines, having a ramble in time. So going from now to then, or looking back to then and bringing it right up to now. So Ramble, had this real focus on old vine fruit and lost and found sort of original varieties that were part of California heritage that I remembered. I could look at the black and white pictures of myself as a kid working in the vineyards and all that. And we had Napa Gamay. We were making, sparkling wine from Napa Gamay at Schramsberg. The original Schramsberg Brut Rosé was called Cuvée de Gamay, and it was made from Napa Gamay. And it was, lovely, so these are charming varieties. I feel these grape varieties not only are they just sentimental for me, but they had good acidity, like varieties like Chenin Blanc, French Colombard, Barbera, Napa Gamay. They had kind of a levity. They weren't as heavy handed. There's a charm, so I felt like, that's what, I wanted to like focus around that as, this like, focal point of what the varieties were and part of the story of like looking back and going new with it. So the Ramble line of wines is in 750 milliliter bottles. And, I have two Chenin Blancs under the Ramble label. It's old vine fruit. And I've had a Valdegui Rosé under the Ramble label, a wine called Untold Reds. That's kind of like, Untold Riches, or, looking back at another story and bringing together, like imagine like a field blend of, Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, Barbera,
Wow.
Napa Gamay, things like that, all in one blend. And then moving on from the Ramble label, I wanted, to explore, more sort of innovation and, sort of bucking the usual a little bit harder. And so we added this label just called Billy D. And we weren't sure at first if we wanted to use the Billy D name, but the name, sort of the venture. But the more that my daughter Abby and I thought about it, and she was really part of the brain trust, as like a 21-year-old, savvy, and creative, and helping me imagine, the lens of, a young consumer who was an organic farmer and, attuned to good quality food and all that. So with Abby, and others brainstorming about it, but Billy D just like struck the right chord. It was like this sort of vibe of, had a little energy. It had a little bit of attitude. And in the Billy D label, we take old vine, great acidity, vibrant, style of wine, and put it in super lightweight glass, 500 milliliter bottles. And we're really like changing the way people drink. If you think about it, like offering a presentation of good quality wine in a maverick, more like down to earth, portable, sort of completely different little cafe bottle. And so that's the Billy D label. So there's the two labels, Ramble and Billy D. And I think some of the tenets around, both of these include, celebrating, like the heritage varieties, really focusing on old vine fruit, organically farmed. I mean, that's, a big distinction there is like, this is all about natural winemaking, natural, growing practices, and a lot of dry farm fruit in the old vines, which, so, we're talking about, less or no use of water, and lower alcohol, which, when I think back to like my original experience as a kid, what were the great wines of like the 70s, or 68 or 74 Napa Cabernets, Heights, or, Andrei Chelichev at Beaulieu Vineyards. These were 12% alcohol wines that were like lasted forever. They were collectible. They were incredible quality. They had finesse and grace. And so for me, today, doing our part, to remember, having wine that's more like accessible and just like you can drink the wine, like you can have a second glass. So
yeah, there's so much there. I want to come back to in a few different questions. That's your why, your what, your how, not necessarily in those particular orders, but in that order. But what are consumers looking for now? And you've touched on in terms of you're making the kind of wine that you like that goes back to the history and what other things Napa or your region can do, but also the lower alcohol part, the acidity, more vessels that are more convenient. We'll get to the sustainability part. But for wine exploring, and, wine is drinking the wine, but it's also history and it's geography and it's passion and it's story. And all of those things you've touched on, I think are really things that consumers are looking and they want that accessibility. So I'd like to come back separately to the natural winemaking, but just to your point about the acidity and the grapes. So I noticed that some of the grapes, and thank you for the description. I think that most people who've gone or who go to Napa now, at least for my Canadian compatriots, they're used to maybe seeing a much shorter list of grape varieties that they might see on their, hitting the Silverado Trail or wherever they're going. So congratulations. And it's exciting that you're bringing back these other grape varieties that one would never expect perhaps to see now. Hopefully that's, you're a leader in setting this trend. But, you are rooted in Napa. Your story around your wines is rooted in Napa. Some of your grapes that you source to make the wines come from nearby regions, Russian River, Mendocino. Can you explain a little bit for people who haven't been to those regions why, what the vineyards are like, why you source from there? And my guess is because climatically, is it the soils? Is it lends themselves for the acidity that you want? Or is there history to those vineyards about who's planted those vines? Like how did this happen that you've got these grapes?
Right. No, yes, we can talk about that. And I will, just to acknowledge that this story and the sort of the example of my mom and dad as entrepreneurs, and the example of the experience in the old Napa Valley, and the fun of, and just like the sort of the taste of life, and how wine was part of just sort of an everyday conversation. That all emanated out of my roots in the Napa Valley. And it's also true that for me to, to find those kind of grape varieties that we're talking about, to find vineyards that were planted, long ago, if we aspire to like old vine fruit sources, like for example, vineyards that were planted in 1940, or, I've harvested grapes from a vineyard planted in 1910. I have to admit that, it's harder for us to find things like that in today's Napa Valley, where there's been a real conversion to close spacing and, modern farming practices. And, it's super, super, super high value land that has, almost, entirely been moved over to plantings of the Bordeaux varieties. And so if I'm looking for, Chenin Blanc or, the old Napa Gamay, I might have to go to a neighboring county like, Mendocino, which was part of the, sort of the original California wine growing experience. You had, these immigrants, as you mentioned, Italians, Germans, French, and there were quite a number of Italian families in particular that were going up into Mendocino County and taking, the history that they had brought from the old world. So, in seeking out old vine fruit and in having this mission to rediscover, these varieties that had good acidity and a good story out of, the sort of original time of California, it led me in particular to Mendocino. And yes, Russian River is a place where I've found old vine French Colombard. And, there are other regions, and we can talk more about other regions as I think some of your thoughts about the future of California wine, and where is climate change going to shift things. But to this point, in pursuit of old vine fruit of these particular varieties, it's led me, to step sort of into neighboring counties, especially Mendocino. And, we do have some Charbono that's come from Napa Valley, for example, really like a sort of that being a true Napa legend. But anyway, I hope that answers sort of that question about.
No, it absolutely does. Gosh, there's so many things that come from that. I might come back to the Bordeaux varieties being planted in Napa in a moment as a broader look at what's happening in California. But before we get to that, natural wines. So you mentioned natural wines. It is that term is used broadly and loosely right now. As far as I know, there's no legal definition. I think in France there is a movement to have a definition, and there are natural wine organizations. And there's a very broad and long continuum as to how natural wines, as we might describe them or categorize them, present and how they're made. So, in your case, when you refer to your wines as being natural wines, can you describe a little bit about the winemaking process, or what aspects, what is involved for you that you think that they're natural wines, or you describe them as natural wines?
Sure. Well, And I just have to say that this, journey for me of appreciating natural wine just started as for me as a consumer. And, back in these days when maybe I was based in New York City as a regional sales manager for Schramsberg, I got to taste a lot of wines that, came from the old world. And, there were wines that I was drinking from Burgundy or the Rhone or from other regions that, maybe there wasn't as much hype and fanfare on the labels talking about it being natural wine. But when you learn more, sort of behind the scenes, there are people that had hundreds of years of experience of biodynamic farming and wines that were low intervention and more gentle and lower in alcohol. And just I started noticing that I just appreciated those wines that were less heavy-handed and more just expressive of so what does that mean like for me now at Billy D, and what's like sort of a definition, or what does it mean to think of natural wine? And the easiest thing for me to think about is just like nothing added and nothing taken away. I mean, if you just want to like sort of strip it down. And I, belong to and participate in a group called Raw Wine, which I go to these trade shows, and there are fairs all over the world. I haven't been able to do all of them, but going to New York and LA, and these shows are in Canada and Berlin, and so that's an organization that has many wineries that participate in it. And just as an example, you're right. There may not be a legal definition, but to be part of communities like that, there are things that are like sort of accepted and understood amidst a community of people that really aspire and believe in the pursuit of natural winemaking. And so I would say, for me, like, picking grapes that are grown without chemicals, that are grown without any pesticides, herbicides, that are grown under organic certification wherever possible is, like a major, crucial step number one. And then, bringing the fruit into the winery, and not adding anything to it. So we're not using inoculations. I'm just relying on, wild native yeast to do the job of fermentation of the wines. And I find that is maybe less like completely under your control, but it happens at a little more slow and delicate and measured pace, and preserves more, I think, eloquence and charm and aromas, and just like the palate and texture of the wine is more intriguing with wild fermentation. So I only do that. And I'm not using anything to change the color or to, like add to the texture or to strip things away or to remove things. So I like the rusticity of natural wine. And if you think about like, I saw someone else, use this, and I like the expression, thinking of natural wine as like, think of a piece of wood with, having little pockets of wood grain and texture and sort of the personality of the grain of wood. You could run your fingers across the wood and you'd feel like little edges. So for me, in natural winemaking, I like that feeling of like a little bit of grip and texture and, like personality. It's not just like, stripped and polished and, sort of like formulaic. There's something living and, like nuanced and alive about it. And so those are ways that I would think of and talk about natural wine.
I like the sense of purity that really you feel like you are drinking that place. If it's done well, if it's been microbiologically stabilized and there isn't any kind of funky stuff that's happened, that's my own view. But that purity takes you to the place. And I really love that. I really love that. You mentioned the color. And so this takes me on to another point. It's going back to the discussion on your bottles. So thank you for mentioning the size of your bottles. 500 mils and 1 liter. The 1 liter, now that's old school. I remember growing up in a European family and it was all about the 1 liter. So I like that concept in terms of hearkening back to, smaller sizes, larger sizes for kind of, family use or
right.
every, toting around. But also you mentioned you're using lighter glass, but on that, I noticed that you use clear glass. So we can see the color, but also is that an indication too that, these are more drink now wines? Is this maybe your daughter, you and Abby talked about, who your market's for, but when your labels and clear glass and you see the beautiful color and lighter, was this a combination of your mission and what you think consumers are, who you think your people are, or who you'd like your people to be?
Yeah. Well, I think you understand, and you're with your own intuition and vibe about it, thoughts that, that we had going into this. And the clear glass, showing off the color, like, for example, the wine made from Napa Gamay, or what's known as Valdiguet. The old name was Napa Gamay for 100 years, but it's got this beautiful, like lighter, sort of energetic color. It's a little bit translucent. You look at it, it's just like, you could almost imagine like a little chill on this wine, kind of like drink me. It's just like, and the color is part of the appeal and just like the visual aesthetic of presenting the wine. So, if we had the ability to put it in clear glass, and yes, it's true that, more dark colored glass, might help protect the wines, from ultraviolet light and so on over long periods of time. And I'm making wines that will age. That's true. But at the same time, it's really more about, like sharing and like breaking this out and enjoying it, like living, now,
Yeah.
wine for all.
With food, and that lower alcohol, right?
So, and I agree, like these are definitely food wines, but I think that letting people see the color, it was like almost like part of the label design or part of the marketing or part of the package was just like literally the color of the wine itself. And lightweight glass, lightweight glass is important. I mean, you touched on this, but I think that for us to be, mission driven about organic farming and about sustainable practices throughout the business and the carbon footprint of wine. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is the weight of the packaging materials. And this era of these, heavy overwrought, grandiose bottles, I think is just like so done. I do like drinking wine out of glass. I mean, I have to admit, if we can trim the weight down to the lowest possible, amount, we're doing a lot to help. I mean, I'm basically putting wine in bottles that, these cases weigh. This glass is like a third the weight of what a lot of wine bottles might weigh.
Also, I guess on the vessels, as I noticed, I think you use screw caps and corks. Is that right? And what are your cork composition like? Where do you get the corks and the screw caps? How did you make that decision, or just happen that way?
Yeah, no. So we've talked about how there are two labels, and Ramble is wine bottle that looks more like a traditional wine bottle. It's a Bordeaux shaped bottle. It's a 750 milliliter bottle that has a cork in it. Although the cork is made out of sugar cane, so it's a fully plant based cork, but made from a different kind of plant as opposed to cork oak. And it's really cool. I mean, it's got some give and take. It feels like a cork. Like when you hold it in your hand, it has like sort of a sponginess to it. It's not plastic. It's made out of plant material, and there's no taint. The cost is good. So I love those corks that were made by a company called Vinvention. It's a U.S. company. So that explains the cork there. And then on the Billy D label, that is bottled in both 500 and 1000, so no 750s there. That comes with a screw cap, and it was just sort of out of the adventure of finding the glass that really fit the bill, finding that really, really special, cool 500 milliliter bottle, and then a companion 1 liter that sort of had felt like it was of the same family. And then that has a screw cap on it. And there's some data behind, sort of the capsule, like exchange of oxygen being very, much comparable to a cork. I mean, they've got, historical numbers to show this sort of gradual rate of very, very, like tiny exchange of oxygen, much like a cork would do. and I found it to be super good. Like we haven't had any kind of issues with the caps. They're very lightweight caps, and it just kind of fits the vibe of bucking, sort of the same old thing, and what we've done with the Billy D label.
Absolutely. And I remember my conversion to screw caps, or in Australia, they refer to them as Stelvins. I guess that's the brand, generic brand. And I remember my first wine tasting trip to the Barossa Valley, and I was like, screw cap, really? Wow. And like premium red wine brands. And they're doing testing now, 10, 15, 20-year vintages later to see how, that oxygen passage that you mentioned and how that has affected the wines. And I guess why I'm mentioning this is because, my trips, tasting various tasting adventures in the Napa Valley, historically is, the heavy glass bottles that, often denoting, premium labels, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, cork, for you, I imagine that part of your business is navigating, or, the marketing, educating consumers, or breaking into this market where heavy bottles and corks have ruled and are, often I think people will think, well, that denotes quality and the high prices. So how do you convince consumers it's okay to try other things? Is it chipping away one consumer at a time, younger consumers, hospitality partners? Like how for other, for you, or you, also in your wine business professorial hat on, if you're giving advice to smaller producers who are bucking it and bringing in something new in their market, what advice do you have? Like, how do you, is it educating the consumer? What do you do? Like, how do you deal with this?
Well, it's definitely a good and a fair question. And, depending on how much, time and resources you have, you can expand, your efforts and energies to create, a bigger kind of educational thrust. I will say that, and I think part of your questions that have already come up have to do with, like, who's the audience for, the kind of wines that you're making. And so that's interesting, because I think that there's no question that I'm thoughtful and interested and committed and like on a mission to appeal to like new generations of consumers to just simply embrace wine, and to say like wine matters, and that we want to like experience wine. And so how do we offer wine to new generations of consumers in a way that actually appeals to them and makes sense to them? And so I think part of the answer to your question is what I'm seeing with my daughter's generation and my son's generation, and and other younger consumers, is that they may not have the same stigma. Like, they don't like have a question or like a sort of a contradiction in their mind that good wine could be in a little bottle that actually looks like a kombucha bottle. Like, that's not a disconnect for them.
Yeah, there's no the same baggage. They're not carrying it.
So, and it might actually appeal to them
Yeah.
more. So, and then you reaching gatekeepers and people that sort of have access to, trying to, I mean, there are some folks, because of just like the roles that they play, or whether they're influencers on social media, or whether they're sommeliers, or people that, sort of keep the gates of, buying wines for, up and coming wine bars. And so, you're trying to circulate and, and share in a world, where people are able to spread your message, whether it's, through buying decisions at retail, or, leading restaurants, getting involved with different kinds of communities, getting people to talk about, what you do, either in press or, getting good press. And having people talk about it. I will say that, yeah, when people find those little bottles, they love to share that, and with the label designs and things like that. So you get some, sort of like sharing. I mean, even James Suckling found, like the little bottle of Billy D. Carignan, and, he posted like a reel. He was sitting at his little cafe table, like sort of like, hey, this is curious, and, all of a sudden 100 people or some shared that. So I guess, there's kind of a grassroots, guerrilla approach. And as you grow, we can add more team members and, spend more money to continue building that.
Yeah. So step by step, organic growth. Where can people find? Well, I imagine your production levels are comparatively small compared to some other Napa producers. So where do people find you? I know maybe I see you have an online shop, and maybe just talk a little bit about your general price range and in broad terms. Where can people find you online? Is that your best way? Are you in shops, or how do
Sure.
people find and try your wines?
Yeah. So the prices of the wines, the Ramble, line of wines is $32, pretty much across the board, like $32 suggested retail. Sometimes you can find a retailer that's, bought in and, doing a promotion, and it might be less. The Billy D little bottles, our suggested retail is $17. But you will find retailers selling them at maybe $15 if they've bought in, at a 5 or a 10 case level. So somewhere between like $15 to $18 on the little bottles, and which is like 2/3 of the size of a traditional wine bottle, and around $32 on the Ramble bottles. Um, Billy D Wines, .com is our website, and yes, the wines are available there. And in our San Francisco Bay Area, places like, and we've had, this is something that I just want to touch on, because when you think about natural wine and the idea of stability and are these kooky wines and all that, it's true that some people just like sort of are happy to go off the rails, but these are wines that are no, you can find wines like this on the wine list at Chez Panisse, where our Buddha's Dharma Chenin Blanc, has had such a great history, or Meadowood or Solage, or, great accounts can sell these wines. Paul Marcus Wines in Rockridge neighborhood of Oakland is a great retailer for us. Gus's Community Markets in San Francisco, Luke's Locals stores, Sunshine Foods in St. Helena here in the Napa Valley. So we have supporters, around, California. I'm starting to move out of state into a few markets now, and we want to continue that. But I would say, of course, Billy D Wines is the place where you can find each and every offering, and I can answer questions directly if people want to just call or send a message or whatever to explain things.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad you listed those places for people visiting Napa Valley then, who may not be from the region, know where to go and look, if, before your wines hit their market. So thank you for specifically noting that, because I get asked often by Canadians or friends of mine in different parts of the world. They're like, "Hey, T, we're going to Napa for 3 or 4 days, or San Francisco. Where should we go?" So thank you. I'm going to make a note of all of those. I also wanted to make a comment about broadly accessibility and your pricing. Fantastic. I think, again, many people think when they're going to California, Northern California, and going into a specialty area and old vines like yours, they'd be thinking at minimum like $80 US a bottle. At least that's what I come to think of often. So, thank you for sharing that. And that goes to the accessibility, I think, which is wine is to be enjoyed now. It's part of life and being together and the ritual. So, and that makes it accessible in addition to the other things that you've talked about. So thank you very much. Just to kind of take things back out a little bit to the bigger picture about California, and drawing on your other expertise as someone who's been there and sees a lot and observe. And I think this is tying into your comment earlier about the plantings, or what the plantings have become like in called the Napa Valley, Napa, and the Bordeaux varieties, and then, Chardonnay. I guess it's twofold. One is drought. Water supply has been a big issue. I know that in addition to lack of rain, my recollection from the last couple of years is that the farmers generally, had some water turned off in the St. Helena area or Sonoma area. Water is a big issue. Drought's a big issue. Places like Spain, Beth was talking when I was chatting with her about Old Vine Spain, drought is a massive issue, and winemakers are moving to different areas, different kind of vines to deal with the weather and climate aspects around farming. So I guess 2 things. One is, will Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay in general terms continue to be able to be produced. I mean, Bordeaux is switching up is thinking about opening up their rules to new varieties because, that can withstand heat and less water, and also, looking in your crystal ball, let's say 10 years from now in St. Helena, Calistoga, rather, what are people going to be seeing and driving by and tasting? Do you think it's going to be similar, the same, or do you think there could be some change on the kind of grape varieties that people are going to be, if visitors and explorers are going to start to see?
Right. Well, it's true that, we're faced, as a wine industry and as a global, population with major, sort of stressful and challenging events with respect to weather and drought, and it's a huge thing, in wine. I think that where we are in Napa, I mean, clearly there's change afoot. Temperatures have been rising, that can be documented. There are people around our Napa Valley area that I think have been outspoken. A couple of winemakers that people can find. Some discussion with a guy named Dan Petrosky, who was at Larkmead, Aaron Weinkauf of Spotswood. Those are a couple of examples of people that I think have been expressive about the idea of evolving, looking for and experimenting with grape varieties in the Napa Valley that that are alternative. I know at Spotswood, I mean, apparently they've been trying, you know varieties that come from Portugal, like Touriga Nacional, or not necessarily from Portugal, but Carignan, I think is interesting, and it's one of the grapes that I use. And I think that sort of the irony is like, why was it that the old time growers they sort of had things figured out a long time ago, varieties that tended to do well, like in these somewhat a little bit inland, California climate, like inland Mendocino or Calistoga, the Napa Valley. Carignan's like a really good variety that was more drought resistant, didn't, seem to require as much irrigation. These old vineyards were dry farm. So I think sometimes when you go back and look at what did people do 100 years ago, it helps see what might actually work again today. So I think you'll see some experimentation. I think Napa Valley, is certainly focused on, with given the cost and such a sort of elite, little small place that this is. And I think in some ways it's unfortunate that it's maybe not that just the economics aren't more down to earth. But I'm not sure that's going to change. So I think you're going to continue to see very curated, kind of luxury, very like specialized experience in Napa. Hopefully that will evolve towards a greater and greater focus on sustainability and, like elevating the importance of that, of, like lower use of water and organic farming and, 100% organic farming. And I think you're starting to see that, like Spotswood and other leaders who have farmed organically for a long time. Maybe we'll get to a point in Napa where, almost everything is organically farmed. And there will be probably some experimentation and evolution of, supplementing Bordeaux plantings with synergistic varieties that have come from traditionally warm areas, whether Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy. So I think you'll see things like that. And then, also, what are emerging areas of California that offer more hope for the expansion of wine plantings, as we go forward. And of course, you see things changing and migrating, like globally. If you look at sort of like climate maps of where grapes are being planted and how that's changing, will you see more grapes being planted up closer into the Sierra Nevadas, or in like the Delta area? I mean, I think that's an area that has promise for continuing grape supply in California, where there's breezes off the San Francisco Bay. So you'll see continuing shifts, and Napa's facing some real challenges. And how do younger consumers participate in today's Napa Valley at the kind of prices that we have and all that? That's a real challenge.
Yeah. No, you touched on so many things there. I think, would warrant another episode just to chat about, for example, that consumer experience. And you mentioned that, the luxury stops aren't going to go away. And I don't think, for the same reasons that heavy glass bottles won't always go away, because some people will want that experience, but also wine is about experiencing it, and often for those who can get to the place, they want to get to the place. I mean, it's passion is driving this. And I know part of the reason why I love wine exploring is because I love being in the place and being and meeting the people.
Absolutely.
Like you and anyone else. And you learn about what is driving this, the passion, the stories, it's the farming, and people want adventure and learning, or just to go and sit and be and taste a glass of wine. And that is not that is beautiful.
Right.
So I agree with you. I don't think visiting wine country is going away. I hope it isn't, because that would make me very sad. But I think the way in which we experience it, there will be more diversity. I think there will need to be, because I think different types of consumers are going to be looking for different things.
Mm-hmm.
But also your point. So thank you on that. And I think that we're dealing with this in British Columbia in a diversity of experience. We're much smaller. We're minuscule compared to California, let alone global production. But, we have a diversity of experiences here, some very luxurious ones, and down to, kind of you go up to someone's shack and try a wine, and it's all a great experience. The other thing you touched on was farming, and going back, looking back to the 100 years ago to how people were farming. And we're dealing with that here too, in terms of the heartbreaking start we've had to the last two vintages here, also to weather, but not from drought, but from freezing cold and or fires and smoke. And some of the discussion here too is about, Mother Nature, it is going to be a roller coaster going forward. So how do we best prepare ourselves for that? And, do we need to look at our viticulture practices here? And in addition to what grape varieties should we be replanting with, but also what are our practices? So thank you for mentioning that, because I think that's also topical in the region that I live in. And I think topical for all the other regions that are facing, and that's most of them now, some sort of swing. So thank you for mentioning that. I mean, I think, and also for mentioning the areas in California and your region where people will look to, for new viticulture and new grape growing adventures. I know we could talk forever, but I think we'll wrap it there for today, because I'm mindful of your time. And I'd like to thank you so much for coming on as my guest, and for sharing your absolute wealth of knowledge and your experience in such an open way. And so thank you. I really, really appreciate it. I'd love to come down again soon to California and come and taste through the flight of your wines, and perhaps go and stomp around near some of the vineyards. And I hope that we can see you in Canada soon, or at least your wines, and we can maybe chat about that separately another time. So thank you so much for joining today.
I would love to get up there, and I would also love to see you down here. And I really appreciate the discussion and the different points that you've thoughtfully brought together in all this conversation. And so yes, let's get together and taste some more wine sometime. We started with a good visit in the caves at Schramsberg. Maybe next time we'll go up to Buddha's Dharma, old vine Chenin Blanc, planted in the 1940s, as a place to experience Chenin Blanc.
I would absolutely like that. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks for tuning into my discussion with Billy Davies today. I hope that you enjoyed our chat. If you've got any questions for Billy, or would like to learn more about his wine project, please do let me know, and I'm happy to connect you with him. Also, please feel free to contact me if you're planning a trip to Napa Valley and are looking for some wine and dine travel tips for when you're there. I'd be happy to give you some. You can reach me by email at tania@ttwinecouncil.com, or on Instagram with the handle TT Wine Explorer, or find me on LinkedIn and message me there. If you've got any friends, family, or colleagues who are interested in Napa Valley or any of the topics which Billy and I discussed today, please do share this episode or series with them. As you know, ratings and comments on platforms like Apple Podcast and Spotify help small podcasters like me expand and grow our listening group. So if you're minded to help me out with things like this, I'd love it. But most importantly, keep exploring and tasting. I look forward to seeing you back here soon on the TT Wine Explorer podcast. Take care.